let's take 3 breaths together to sort of get us all on the same wavelength. So we're going to breathe in and very slowly and inhale and exhale. And one more time. Breathe in and breathe out. Thank you, friends. It is wonderful seeing so many people here this morning. Between the book sale and the time change, I'm in awe.
Good morning. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this morning, both those here in Fulgulson Hall and also those online who have joined us, and a special welcome to all of our visitors. My name is Sandy Prinz. My pronouns are she and her, and I have the pleasure of being your worship associate this morning. Also participating in our service this morning are Reverend Gail, Reverend Gail Lindsay Mariner, for those who may not know, and our pianist Lydia Madrick. We're grateful especially to the tech team, Michael Morford, John Lehman, and Gemma Sparrow, who enable us to reach all of you at home or away. To our staff, Aaron Levitman, Mary Quaitz, and Douglas Kramer. To Jane King for the wonderful chancel arrangement. To our greeters and welcomers, parking lot monitors, coffee makers, and all of the many people who helped to make this morning happen. Please join us in singing hymn 188, Come, Come, Whoever You Are.
Yeah, I think we'll sing it through twice. And, in anticipation of singing it as a round on another Sunday. Please rise as you are willing and able. Our opening words come from the Reverend Michelle Collins, who writes, "We arrive carrying the familiar ache of not enough time, not enough rest, not enough certainty about what comes next. But here, in this space between one breath and another, something small and persistent whispers, you are held." We come from days that felt too ordinary to notice, commutes and meetings, dishes and deadlines, the unremarkable hours that make up most of our living. But buried behind the mundane lie small miracles that we walk past without seeing. Some of us learn to count blessings on our fingers. Others to whisper thanks to the ancestors, or earth or sky. We carry different languages of gratitude, different ways of recognizing what it is that sustains us. And all of them are welcome here.
we light ours to the words from Catherine Robinson. In our time of upheaval and despair, we light a flame of sharing, the flame of ongoing life. In this time when we search for understanding and serenity in the face of so much uncertainty, we light our chalice as a sign of our quest for truth, meaning, and community. Thank you, Lydia. I usually associate fasting with going without food. However, fasting does not have to mean deprivation, but instead, it can provide for a mental and spiritual awakening, an appreciation of what is. This reading is from Thich Nhat Hanh's Nothing Comes from Nothing in How to Eat, which is down here. With just a little bit of mindfulness, you can truly see where your bread comes from. It does not come from nothing. Bread comes from the wheat fields, from hard work, from the baker, the supplier, and the seller. But the bread is more than that. The wheat field needs clouds and sunshine. See, in this slice of bread, there is sunshine, there is cloud. There is the labor of the farmer, the joy of having flour, and the skill of the baker, and then, miraculously, the whole cosmos has come together so that this piece of bread can be in your hand. You don't need to do a lot of hard work to get this insight. You only need to stop letting your mind carry you away with worrying, thinking, and planning.
So let's name the challenge we are facing this morning. We are headed into a season of feasting. Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, all of those holidays coming up, just at a time when many of our neighbors have been furloughed, or are working without pay, or have been laid off, or are hiding. We are moving into a season filled with holidays at a time when children and elders here and around the world are hungry. We are gearing up for parties and treats at the same time SNAP benefits have been cut. Even with all of our best efforts, there are people who are going to be hungry. And it isn't that folks aren't trying to help. Our governor and legislature have allocated $30 million to help keep New Mexicans fed through the 10th of the month. The Food Depot has been working in anticipation of this moment since back in June and July when we did our last Food Depot collection. They're ramping up operations, as are the pantries and the food distribution sites. There are there's a really hopeful, spontaneous bubbling up of folks who are making sack lunches or declaring that in their restaurants kids eat free, or deciding they're going to join the burrito brigade and hand out burritos on Sunday afternoon. Indivisible is tag teaming with the Food Depot and launching a citywide, statewide food drive. So I pulled out our barrels today, and just in case y'all wanted to get a head start on filling them, the official drive starts a week from tomorrow, but we've got some bins out there. If possible, I invite you to focus on canned protein. That seems to be the hardest thing to come by. Chicken or tuna, red and black beans, chili with meat, peanut butter. Calories are good, but nourishment is really important. So this is the context that we find ourselves in at the beginning of November as we begin our reflections on the theme of gratitude. Months ago, the worship team suggested that we should explore the notion of fasting as part of our reflections on gratitude this month, and I had no idea how timely that topic would be. Fasting is an ancient religious practice that is part of many, many different traditions. People who fast voluntarily abstain from something. In faith communities, that's usually food, or drink, or work, or sex, or all of the above. But people also fast these days from media, right? Fast from Facebook, fast from all your electronics, fast from tech in general, or driving, or talking. That's a hard one. And people fast for really different reasons. The one we think of, or at least that I always thought of growing up in a Christian tradition where we fasted during Lent, fasting was about penance, right? It was about doing without something and mortifying the flesh somehow. And it was not fun, and it wasn't comfortable, and I didn't like it as a kid, you know? And I think lots of us kind of develop an aversion to going without. And we see that more broadly in our culture, too. We want to have what we want to have. And really, if we could be on Prime and get it that way sooner, yeah. Sometimes, though, people aren't fasting particularly to mortify the flesh. They're just following a cycle of religious holidays. Orthodox Christians have a very complicated year-round cycle where they're forever avoiding one thing or another thing. Jewish holidays include times of abstinence, and during Ramadan, our Muslim neighbors do not drink or eat between sunrise and sunset, and then they break their fast in community. What you discover when you decide not to eat for a while is that cooking and eating take a lot of time and a lot of bandwidth. And so fasting frees up space in your schedule and in your consciousness that you can use to do something else. Now, traditionally, within a faith tradition, that is meditate or pray or do good works. Hunger strikers fast in protest of injustice. Sometimes people fast in solidarity with those who are hungry or suffering. And sometimes people fast as a way of waking themselves up so that they pay attention to things that they've been taking for granted. When you think about it, fasting is nothing more or less than a spiritual tool that we can use for directing our attention towards something we've decided is important. This month, in this particular moment, we might choose to fast in a couple of these ways. We might choose to skip a meal. We might choose to notice what hunger feels like, to feel solidarity with those who've lost their SNAP benefits or who've been laid off. And we might send what we would have spent on that meal to help support some group that feeds people. If skipping a meal isn't appropriate for you for health reasons or other reasons, you might just give up a single foodstuff. No chocolate for the month of November. Or, no coffee. And then you might take the money that you save by not stopping to buy a coffee each morning, and you might donate that to help feed someone else. Either of these ways of fasting would be a way of expressing solidarity for the folks who are being harmed by the actions of our government. But we might also want to fast for less political reasons. We might want to fast to help us pay attention to our own behavior patterns. We might want to fast as a mindfulness exercise to help us stop taking things for granted. Things like sugar or meat or caffeine or our cell phone, but also things like family and friends and community. We might want to use fasting to help us overcome our own feelings of scarcity or anticipated scarcity and actually experience our abundance.
Each Sunday, we place 4 stones in our chalice to help us remember the future we are working for. The mountain-shaped stone prompts us to imagine a world where this place where we gather, called Ntiwa Ogapoge, meaning White Shell Place, is cared for joyfully by the descendants of its ancestral occupants, together with all of those who have come to love it and dwell here. The geode inspires us to imagine a world where peace is endemic and war is a thing from the distant past, understood as an acute and deplorable failure of the imagination. The ancient fossil, studded stone, helps us imagine a world thriving in the midst of climate change, a world where human participation contributes to the biosphere that is vibrant and diverse and deeply alive. The layered stone asks us to imagine that the vein of quartz that divides it actually holds it together. May it help us imagine a time when the differences between us are understood as boundaries that connect us. We honor these boundaries and our differences and use democratic processes to ensure that all of us thrive. And a robust democracy become realities as we and other good-hearted folks around the world work together to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, fight for democracy, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet. May we feast on the joy and meaning that emerge from these struggles.
So we set aside a time each Sunday morning to share the sorrows and joys that are currently shaping our lives. We do this because we know that sorrows that are shared are easier to bear, and joys that are shared are multiplied. And so we have a joy from your book sale team, deep gratitude. Thank you to all of the book sale donors and volunteers and shoppers. The sale was the best ever, raising over $6,000 for UU Santa Fe. Please consider taking some of the remaining boxes of books in the portal to one of your favorite charities here in town. They won't let us go and dump them all with them. We have to dribble them out, a few people and a few boxes at a time. Maya Goldberg's daughter, Erica, from Birmingham, Alabama, spent a week here, and they had a restful, sweet time together. That is definitely a candle of gratitude and joy. Here is a note from your membership team. Please welcome Charlie Batista, our newest member, who signed the book this morning. Yay, welcome Charlie. We have joy from Andrea Casut, a candle of joy for reunion with my 100-year-old mother, whom I found and met for the very first time in 2013 after a lifetime apart. After 10 years of her return to silence, we spent last weekend together in Denver, going to restaurants, Walmart, and the Botanic Gardens. She is still sassy, stylish, smart, and curious, and modeled for me this delightful phrase of disagreement. I'm so happy that you think that. Mary Nykirk has returned back to the Fiesta Park Rehabilitation Center down in Albuquerque. She has a lot of strength she needs to gain, we discovered, before she can be at home on her own. She writes that she would love to hear from people, and I would add that when you are alone in rehab, you need all the moral support you can get to keep doing the work that you need to do to get better. So please, cards, calls, text messages, they're all welcome. All right, who else is in here? Richard Block writes, "Dear many thoughtful folks, in the last couple of weeks I have received so many thoughtful cards wishing me a quick and complete recovery after my dislocated shoulder. I thank all of you for your kind thoughtfulness, and I am improving bit by bit, and I will start rehab in the coming week. I hope to get back to being active very soon." All right. And Eva, who is here, and Dick both celebrate birthdays this week. Happy birthday to both of you. You have heard me say many times, friends, that one of the great joys of doing ministry in Santa Fe, New Mexico, is the number of fabulous visitors that we get. People come to explore the land of enchantment and come and discover the congregation of enchantment as well. So we welcome today, and if you are visiting, please feel free to raise your hand or not, as you choose. So Wes Sandell of Santa Fe, Elizabeth, Sally, and Marisa from Santa Fe, Tamara Bishop from Phoenix, Jackie and Stan Darnell from Allen, Texas, welcome, Eileen Adiko from Salem and Santa Fe, Jan McDowell from Carrollton, and January, who lives here in Santa Fe. Welcome to you all. All right, now, we're going to go ahead and light a last candle for the sorrows and joys we carry in our hearts. But before we actually sing Spirit of Life, I need to give you a few tiny instructions. We are going to, in our meditation, practice something called the mindful bite. It's a way of, it's a mindfulness exercise. Often it's done with a raisin. We're going to pass these little cups full of, each one has a grape inside the little paper frill. Please take one, but don't eat it until we get to that point in the meditation. So fast from your little piece of fruit for a few minutes until it's time for us to explore the experience together. So go ahead and just take one and then pass the basket backwards. And we have one more over here. All right, and then, while the baskets are moving, we're going to sing Spirit of Life. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, when you put a piece of fruit in your mouth, all you need is a little bit of mindfulness. You just need to be aware, I am putting this piece of apple or grape in my mouth. Your mind doesn't need to be somewhere else. If you're thinking about work while you chew, that's not eating mindfully. When you pay attention to the apple, that is mindfulness. And then you can look more deeply, and in just a very short time, you'll be able to see the apple seed, the orchard, the sky, the farmer, the picker, and so on. There's a lot of work in that apple. Now, years ago, I read Aldous Huxley's Island. Island is the utopian counterpart to his dystopia, Brave New World. And there's a practice in here that he calls chewing grace, but that I think of as the mindful bite. It's simple. When you eat, take time to give your full attention to the first bite. I invite you to try this now with that grape in its little paper cup. Close your eyes, and if you are willing, let go of everything else and pull your attention into the moment. Become aware of the room, aware of your body, aware of your hand holding that little paper frill. Look at your grape. Think about where it came from and how it got here, and the sun and the rain and the grape and the people who picked it. And after a few moments of this lovely diversion, notice again the physical presence of the fruit. Notice its color and its moistness. Does it have a fragrance? Can you find the dimple where the stem was? Take your time and put the grape in your mouth, noticing its weight and its texture, noticing the squirt of juice and its sweetness or its sourness, and how your mouth waters in response. What does your tongue notice as you chew and swallow? One mindful bite. So you know what you are eating and create the space to be grateful for this morsel of food, for this morsel of life, and for everything that made it possible for you to enjoy it.
In an article titled, "Don't Count Your Blessings, Do This Instead," Ozan Verrill writes, instead of asking participants to reflect on the presence of a positive event, for instance, I'm grateful I met my wife, they asked participants to reflect on its absence. What if I had never met my wife? In other words, they asked participants to undo positive events and picture a counterfactual world where that positive event had never happened. The results were striking.
Kept a gratitude journal on and off for years. This little reading caught my attention. The exercise it suggests struck me as a combination of the idea of fasting that we explored in the first part of the service and then the mindful bite meditation we just explored. Instead of focusing intently on the presence of a good thing, the authors asked people to focus on the imagined absence of that thing. They called what happened next the George Bailey effect. You remember George Bailey? He's that guy in the Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Suicidal George is shown by the angel how much worse off the world would have been without him. And in the process, he comes to appreciate his own life and all the people who care about him. Now, the research these guys did was published on PubMed. The article, if you want to go look for it, is called It's a Wonderful Life. Mentally subtracting positive events improves people's affective states, contrary to their affective forecasts. Really catchy title, but there you go. It turns out that they were able to document that imagining the absence of a thing we care deeply about can function in much the same way as fasting does to help us not take that thing for granted. Scientists call this dishabituation. When we unadapt, when we dishabituate from a thing, it feels new again. And that helps us appreciate it. And that triggers our feelings of gratitude. So imagining the absence of a good thing is a great setup for enjoying its presence, okay? Let's try it for just a moment. I'm going to make a huge assumption here. I'm going to assume that because you're here this morning, UU Santa Fe is a positive presence in your life. And so I invite you to close your eyes and imagine what your life would be like if you never found this community. How would your days be different? Which friends would you never have met? What classes and authors and justice activities might you never have discovered and never have participated in? What books might you never have read or purchased or given away if you had never been part of UU Santa Fe? What ideas might you never have entertained? Take a moment and think about what would be absent from your life without this faith and this community. Not that your life would necessarily be any less happy, just that many of the things and people you value and enjoy in your life as it is might not be a part of who you are. Take a breath. Open your eyes and look around and feast on the faces of the people you care about here. Feast on this beautiful place and this lovely community. Absence, whether it is real or imagined, actually does help the heart grow fonder. It can help us appreciate what we have. It can trigger gratitude and generosity. As we move into the holiday season over the next month, 6 weeks, 2 months, however long you count your holiday season. As you move into the holiday season, we can use this little bit of information to enrich everything that we do. We can use it to help us be mindful of our abundance before we actually savor that abundance. We can fast from food before we feast on it, even if it's just refraining from taking the bite of the grape until Gail says so. We can, before our friends or relatives to show up to celebrate with us, we can imagine how the holiday would be different if they weren't there. Whether or not we have been avoiding cookies or turkey or cranberry sauce or pumpkin spice, we can practice a mindful bite with each celebratory food or each meal. And we might experiment with an adaptation of that I think of as the mindful moment. When I was a little girl, I would come racing home from school back in elementary school. And, of course, the first thing I had to do was duck into the bathroom next to the front door. But I would start talking the minute my hand touched the doorknob of the house. And my mom was kind of amazing. I was the oldest of 4. She was right there, and she would stand outside the bathroom door and listen while I unloaded all of the things that were going on with my day, right? And by the time I got to sit on the corner of the kitchen counter where I'd finished the details, most of my story was done. But I felt seen and loved. So I would encourage you, as you encounter the people you love, in that first minute that they arrive, to give them your undivided attention, the same way you gave your attention to the grape. Your full, complete, not worrying about what's on the stove, not worrying about what's going to happen next, just the attention. 2 minutes, maybe, if that, while they finish arriving and the two of you are present together. We can be mindful about all the good that's part of our lives. We can allow the abundance that we have to fill our awareness to the point where our hearts open and overflow. And then, when we're actually present to the goodness in our lives, it becomes easy to take just a little bit of that good fortune and share it with someone else. Call a friend in the hospital. Pick up some extra peanut butter at the grocery store and pick it and put it in one of the bins. Or sign up and help sort donations at the food pantry. I have a sign-up sheet for that. We need to know your name, your contact information, and whether you'd be willing to donate an hour in the morning, afternoon, or evening of a weekday or a weekend. So that's the first one. I'm going to start that going down this side. You don't have to fill it out, but if I pass it out right now, more people will look at it and think about it. You might also give generously to Interfaith Community Services. That's the recipient of those bright lime green envelopes. And we have been supporting the folks at the Safe Outdoor Spaces micro-community up at Christ Lutheran for maybe a year and a half now, almost 2 years, I think. And we do it by providing meals for the 20 folks who live there whenever there's a holiday. Because LifeLink does the meals there on regular weekdays, and there's a food truck that does their charitable giving by covering the weekends, but neither LifeLink or the food truck work on the holidays. So we've provided holiday meals, and it's been wonderful for the folks doing it and wonderful for the folks receiving it. But Unitarian Universalists have this, inconvenient habit of having lives and families. And it just so happens that for the first time in a year and a half, all of our volunteers are doing Thanksgiving somewhere else for someone else. And so we need some volunteers to help provide the food for our folks at the SOS micro-community. We're providing food for about 20 people for Thanksgiving Day and the day after. The yellow sheet. If you are interested and able to participate, your name, your contact, and something you could bring. Dinner rolls, stuffing, green beans, pumpkin pie, whatever you would like to bring. Go ahead and pass that around. I will have both sign-up sheets available in the foyer after the service, and next week you can go and look at your calendar. But if you're feeling your abundance, this is a lovely way to share it. Fast from the things you take for granted. Feast on the goodness that is yours. Share what you have in abundance. May it be so. So earlier last week, 2 weeks ago, I got the chance to talk to Kent Grubbs. Kent Grubbs is the chairman of the board of Interfaith Community Services. Now, you may not know what Interfaith Community Services is. Last June, when we had our congregational meeting, we voted to do a first Sunday giving for Pete's Place. And then in August, Pete's Place became Agape House. And I think most people thought that the group of people who had organized Pete's Place and done the work for Pete's Place just sort of evaporated. But that's not so. They have a number of projects that are going on. They have a big vision for what might happen in the future. And Kent isn't available to talk to us this week. He's happy to come back later in the month. But we videotaped him, so he can tell you just a little bit about how the folks who created the Interfaith Shelter are still serving the hungry and unhoused here in Santa Fe.
Good morning, everyone. I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Unitarian Universalist congregation today, especially since this community has been so supportive of Interfaith in the past with both your treasurer and your volunteers. I wish I could be with you in person today, but given the wonders of our modern world, I can at least be with you virtually and certainly in spirit. I'm glad to have the opportunity today to talk to you about what's going on at Interfaith Community Services. To paraphrase a well-known expression attributed to Mark Twain, the reports of our death have been greatly exaggerated. I'm Kent Grubbs, and on July 1st, I became the board chair of Interfaith Community Services. And if you've been reading the papers, you know that a lot's been going on with our organization since that date. But I'm here to tell you today that we are alive and kicking in several different areas. With respect to our current operations, we currently run 3 programs. Firstly, our Showers to Go program takes a mobile hygiene unit to 3 locations in Santa Fe every week, where we provide hot showers, a sack lunch, toilet facilities, and case management services to our unhoused clients. In the 3 months from July through September of 2025, about 250 people avail themselves of these services. Secondly, we run a seniors motel program at the Days Inn on Cerrillos Road, where about 25 unhoused seniors receive a room, a hot meal, and case management services designed to get them into permanent supportive housing. And finally, we continue to serve as the fiscal agent of Consuelo's Place, a non-congregate shelter located on the Midtown campus. But I think it's fair to say that our real focus nowadays is on building a new resource outreach center for the homeless in Santa Fe. Interfaith came to the view several years ago that our old location at 2801 Cerrillos Road, commonly known as Pete's Place, was not a viable long-term option for the provision of our services or for the services that we intended to provide in the future. So beginning about a year ago, we started planning in earnest for a new facility in a new location designed using trauma-informed principles that is purpose-built for the specific needs of the Santa Fe community. We call this facility the Resource and Opportunity Center, or the ROC for short. So, what exactly is the ROC? Well, the ROC is being designed to address 3 significant gaps in Santa Fe's homelessness response system. Firstly, the ROC will provide expanded shelter capacity. There are currently about 280 emergency shelter beds in Santa Fe, a number that hasn't appreciably changed in at least 5 years and probably longer. And those 200 beds are intended to serve a population that at a minimum is 400 people and probably a lot bigger. So in one fell swoop, the Rock can increase the shelter bed capacity in Santa Fe by almost 50%. And we're looking at a hybrid model with respect to bedding where congregate, semi-congregate, and non-congregate options are available to our guests, choices that suit the particular needs of our particular community. Secondly, the Rock will serve as a day center where people can have their daily needs met during regular business hours, regardless of whether they spent the night with us or not. A place where people can get a hot meal, get a shower, do their laundry, have access to the internet, kennel their dogs, get their electronic devices charged, receive free distributed clothing, and so many other things. Right now, there is not such a place in Santa Fe for our unhoused guests. And that's one of the main reasons why you see people lugging their belongings on the sidewalks up and down Cerrillos Road and elsewhere. These folks simply don't have a place to go during the day to get off the streets, to get out of the weather, and to just be. The Rock will provide that service. And finally, the Rock is envisaged to be a centralized services hub, a one-stop shop where our partner service organizations can engage our guests directly with life-stabilizing services, such as medical care, behavioral health services, housing navigation, drug and alcohol treatment, and others. And when I say one-stop shop, what I mean is that employees of our partner organizations, such as the LifeLink, La Familia Medical Center, Santa Fe Recovery Center, will have their employees physically located with us at the Rock on our campus so that they can engage directly with our clients to provide the services that their organizations provide. You know, it's just not good enough for a case manager at Interfaith to sit down with a client, make an appointment for that client, say at St. Elizabeth's near the rail yard, and then expect that client to get themselves to St. Elizabeth's and show up at the appointed hour. We have to defeat the tyranny of distance by having a physical location where partner organizations and our clients are at the same place at the same time. That's what other leading edge facilities do, such as Haven for Hope in San Antonio or the Gateway Center in Albuquerque. In this way, the Rock can serve as the front door to Santa Fe's homelessness response system. Because Interfaith doesn't operate in isolation. We're part of a broader system with other local agencies, each playing a unique role with their unique service offerings for the benefit of our unhoused clients. And I'm happy to say that our partner service organizations want to participate with Interfaith in this brave new undertaking. Because homelessness affects everyone in our community. Our residents, of course, but business owners, tourists, first responders, emergency rooms. Just about everyone in our town is affected in one way or another by homelessness. So the Rock isn't just another shelter. It's an entirely different concept, one that is intended to provide a community solution to a community challenge. And it's not just about the building. We're taking this opportunity to re-examine every aspect of our service delivery model. And in that vein, we visited with experts from facilities in Houston, in San Antonio, in Albuquerque, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Denver to gain insights on their operations and import those best practices to Santa Fe. You'll be hearing more about the Rock in the coming weeks and months as we begin our public engagement process. You know, Santa Fe has a huge need, and for sure, the Rock is a huge undertaking for Interfaith. But we also have a huge opportunity. What we are envisaging is something that Santa Fe has never yet seen, but desperately needs. Other cities have done it, and so can we. So please join us be part of this journey to serve the least of these. In the meantime, I encourage you to go to our website, www.interfaithsheltersf.org, and sign up for our newsletter communications so that you can be kept abreast of our ongoing activities as well as planning for the Rock. Again, I truly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Thanks so much for your attention, and I wish you a blessed day.
All right. Thank you, friends. So you know the drill. Put a bill with the denomination of your choice inside your lime green envelope. Close it, but do not seal it, because we reuse the envelopes. And Leon, do you have a few words to say? Let's start tossing the baskets to collect those envelopes. While Leon talks a little bit about the way your contribution supports that foundation.
Thank you, Reverend Gale. So just quickly, how many of you said after the last few months, what we really need is an extra hour? Yeah, me neither. Anyway, I'm here on behalf of your Board of Trustees, and thank you for your ongoing support. You know, we're kicking off the Stewardship Committee again. You'll be hearing more about that, probably from Brian, in the coming days or weeks. But what a wonderful message you gave today, Reverend Gale, on just envisioning what it'd be like if this place wasn't here. And what makes it possible is the generosity of treasure and talent of all of us. So with that, the baskets are being passed, and what doesn't go in the green envelope will go into our coffers. And I thank you for being here.
We extinguish the chalice today with words by Martha Kirby Koppel. Our time together is finished, but our work is not done. May our spirits be renewed and our resolve strengthened as we meet the challenges of the week to come. This chalice flame is extinguished until we ignite it again with the spark of our communion.
Please reach out and take hands with someone who is near you. And I invite you to repeat after me. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love flow through us and walk among us. As we live our lives and work to heal our world. Amen, shalom, namaste, blessed be. Assalamu alaikum, ashe, aho. Turn and greet your neighbors, friends, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.